right. Today we are going to cover jQuery after a false start. I was mistaken. I thought the earlier weather application used jQuery, but I was mistaken. But anyhow, now's the correct time for it. Before we do that, I want to show you a Google Chrome Inspect Element feature that can be useful, especially when you're trying to figure out why something changes or doesn't change based on your CSS. Which you run into sometimes with Bootstrap. Because with Bootstrap, there is pre-written CSS that can get applied to things, and it's not always clear what style takes precedence for it. Usually using inline styles can take care of that, but at any rate, Google Inspect can be useful for that too. And I have a video. One thing I want to review is the nature of a blended class. With the nature of the blended class, remember there is other material that you need to go over beyond what is covered in lecture. So that's an assumption. So in the 1 hour lecture that I have or 50-minute lecture that I have, I'll cover as much of this stuff as I can. That being said, I've posted other resources for you to cover. The other thing I want to review and remind you of is that you are encouraged to interact with me, whether it be via email or showing up for lab or showing up for lab online or whatever. You're encouraged to interact with me because again, I mean, that's part of the characteristics of a blended lab. We only meet once a week. We only have lecture once a week. But again, there's ample time otherwise, either during my office hours or I can schedule another time for us to meet and discuss things that you're having trouble with. So that's sort of an expectation of this class. I'll do a lot. I'll do everything I can to help you try to understand this, but you have to meet me halfway and you have to let me know when you're having difficulty and you're having trouble with something. All right, anyhow, Google Inspect Element. Let's say we are viewing a web page and we go to developers, more tools, developers tools. This is a wonderful feature, all right, that you can use for all sorts of things. It has a console, it can show you if there's any JavaScript errors and so on. If you go to right mouse on something and do an inspect, it will show you the specific thing on the page and it will show you the CSS that applies. So for example, I right moused on jQuery UI. All right. The style that applies to that is a title external URL link, which is in this portion of the style sheet and so on down the line. Let's pull up the example that we had from last week that used Bootstrap. That's a little more relevant to what I'm talking about here. Let me download it. And we'll look at it. So we have our Bootstrap page. I go to more tools, developers tools. Again, I can see if there's any errors on the console. I can also pick an element and inspect, and it will show me that this paragraph gets its style from these places. So that's useful in helping me understand where the style comes from so I can overrule it. Let's say for some reason this paragraph is special, this paragraph here, and I want to overrule the style sheet that Bootstrap has for it. I could give it a different class, possibly. That could be useful. But let's say I just want to go in and force the style to be different. I can go into, let's see, that's the third section, I believe. Third section. I could put on here an internal style. And I believe that will work. See if it does. No, it doesn't. Oh, I spelled style wrong. Maybe that's a problem. That still doesn't do it. Let's see. Put the style on the paragraph. Yeah, and there you go. Makes that paragraph white. So that's the way I can override what Bootstrap is doing. The other thing I could do is I could give it a class of my own or an ID of my own and apply the style that way. So there's a lot of ways that you can override the style. And again, the inspect element sort of helps you figure what style is currently being applied to that. And that can be useful whether you're using Bootstrap or your own CSS. Okay, on to jQuery business. To review what I started off a few weeks back, jQuery is a library built on top of JavaScript. So jQuery is a bunch of functions that developers have created that makes using JavaScript easier. It's just like if you have created your own functions put it in a JavaScript file, you can use those functions on many pages. You know, we talked about that before about like having a function to make menu items appear and disappear. All right, if you got that to work, you could put that in your own library of functions, and then you could use that on any page if you coded it correctly. All right, the idea of jQuery is this. Someone did that with a lot of very useful functions that makes your life easier. So jQuery in itself really isn't another language. It's a library built on top of JavaScript that facilitates the use of JavaScript. So let's look at the JavaScript tutorial, or the jQuery tutorial. jQuery is a JavaScript library, simplifies, easy to learn. All right, here is something that we have in jQuery. Document.ready function. Any paragraph that's clicked, I want to call this function and I want to hide it. Now you could do that in JavaScript, but it would be much more complicated. There'd be a longer instruction to do the onReady event for the window. You would then have to get by tag, get items by tag, or get elements by tag name. And then you'd have to loop through them all. So this example shows you the code that you'd have to write to loop through all the TDs on your page. Well, you can do that much more concisely in jQuery. This tells me I want to select everything that's a paragraph of P, and I want to add to it a click function, and here is the function. So if we try it by ourselves, anything we have here, we click, and we click, and it makes it disappear. Of course, we don't have anything that makes them reappear. But this saves us several instructions and is much simpler to implement in jQuery as compared to JavaScript. So the first thing, one of the workhorses in jQuery is this idea right here, $, and then in parentheses is the P. P relates to an HTML tag. You can use the same thing that you would use in CSS. So I can make everything of a certain class. So let's do that. Let's say I don't want every paragraph to disappear. I just want those with a class of clickable. So I'm going to define class equals clickable for this one and this one. My selector then is not I want every P, I want everything with a class of clickable. So I run that, I can make the first one disappear, I can make the second one disappear. The third one does not disappear because it does not have a class, or the middle one actually doesn't disappear because it does not have a class of clickable. So this is sort of like get element by ID, but it's much more powerful. We don't only use IDs by it, we can use any combination of the things that you use in CSS, the selectors we use in CSS. So we can use classes, we can use IDs, or we can use HTML tags. So I could do this. Let's change this. Let's make this an ID of clickable. And let's remove the ID from this one. Because again, there should only be one thing on the page for a given ID. And I can say, select the thing on the page that has an ID of clickable and give it an onClick function. So this doesn't disappear, but this one does. So this is sort of the first thing to notice in jQuery is this allows us to select in a much more versatile way than simply get element by ID. And it allows us to select where there are multiples of things on a page. Get element by ID is only going to return one element because an ID is supposed to be unique. But if you want to select by tag, you can do that in JavaScript by get elements by tag, but then you have to loop through your results to look at each member of that array individually. You don't have that with this method of accessing it. It will loop through all of them for you. So it's much better than it's much simpler than using get element by ID. I won't say it's better. Now, one thing to keep in mind is we can mix and match. So I don't have to do everything exclusively in JavaScript. Or I'm sorry, jQuery. I can mix and match and I could do jQuery. So for example, I could make it so if you click on this, it changes the inner HTML. So I could use the DOM and say inner HTML equals I just changed. This in this expression refers to the thing that you clicked on. So this dot inner HTML means the thing that I clicked on, it's inner HTML. So I've sort of mixed this part of it, which is jQuery, and this part of it, which is just plain old DOM, plain old vanilla JavaScript and DOM. Except it doesn't work. All right, what happens when something doesn't work? We stare at it, right? Of course not. We look at the console, for one thing. And see if there's any errors. These are not relating to the code that I put there in it. Let's actually go and make an HTML page. Let's save this as an HTML page, so I'm not running it through W3 Schools. And let's call this one example. On this one, nothing happens. Let's go and look at the console. No errors. Okay, interesting. I'm going to write to the console what this is. Wait a minute. Apparently you need to do this. There we go. So again, I'm using this because that means the thing that I've just clicked on. So whenever you're in like an on-click event, if you say this, it means the thing that got clicked on. So this is a mix of I guess my bigger point is this is a mix of jQuery and just plain old JavaScript. In other words, this is just a plain old vanilla JavaScript command. The rest of these things are jQuery. All right. let's look more on this tutorial. Browser compatibility, all major browsers support, oh, I'm looking at the wrong thing. All right, correct selector to hide all P elements. Of course, that is P. Is that correct? And it's correct. It's a neat tool here to go, and I encourage you to go through this tutorial stuff. Here is a jQuery quiz. You can go through. Which of the following is true? jQuery is a JavaScript library. jQuery uses CSS selectors to select elements. That's true. What sign does jQuery use as a shortcut for jQuery? The $sign. Look at the following selector. What does it select? It selects all div elements. Is jQuery a library for client scripting or server-side scripting? This is client-side JavaScript. And I'm not going to do the rest of the quiz, but you get the idea. And there's a whole bunch of other examples that you can try and play with jQuery. Give some background information. Now, in order for jQuery to work, you need to download the jQuery library. And you can download it, or let me rephrase that. You have to include the jQuery library on your web page. You can do that one of two different ways. You can download the library and use your own version of it, a local file, or you can point to a version of it on the web. And this is a case where it is okay to hot link like this. Normally, in a lot of my web development classes, I talk about not hot linking. Hot linking is where you use the URL of something on another web server, like for an image, all right, or whatever. Here it is okay to do that. They mentioned an advantage here. You can download jQuery. As a result, it'll be loaded from cache when they visit your site, and so on. So, if you host, if you advantage using the hosted jQuery, make sure the once a user requests file will be served the server closest to them, which leads to a faster loading time. So I can include jQuery either this way by going and downloading jQuery. And how would I download it? Go to jQuery. And I could download it. There it is. That's the compressed version or the minimized version. The uncompressed version is this. Usually, you want the compressed version in production because it's a smaller file size. But I would right mouse and just say save link as, and I could download it to my machine. Or save the compressed or the uncompressed version to my machine. And if I look at it, there's a difference in file size. The compressed is 87 KB. The uncompressed is 288, is that, yeah, 288 KB. So really, with today's internet speed, it almost doesn't matter which one you use. Yeah, the compressed is smaller, but you know, and it's better to use a compressed because over a volume of requests, that does add up, I suppose. But it's probably not as dramatic as it used to be. But you have to download it. So either you can download it or you can use the hosted version of it. From here, for example, and if you want to include the jQuery 3.0, you would just copy and paste this, and you'll be using it hosted on the Google API server. jQuery is open source, so you could conceivably alter it or make plugins of your own. We go here to plugins. There are plugins for animation, for example, that add upon it. And here's the code that you can go and download the version for. And again, it's built on top of jQuery. So if you notice in my example that I copied from the W3C page, we download it. I'm sorry, we don't download it. We access it off of their site, but you could also download it to your server if you wanted to. More than likely, I would just point to it on the web. Again, that is probably, you know, there's some efficiencies to doing that. But you do have to have a copy of it running locally. Otherwise, none of this will work. Selector action. And again, we talked about the selector before. And then there's a set of functions. And this is a good description. This will hide the current element. P.hide will hide all the paragraph elements. This will hide all the elements with the class of test, and so on. This allows you to put code in that fires up when the document has loaded. We had talked about that before, and this is very important. When you write JavaScript that starts using the different things on the page, those things don't exist in many cases until the page has completed loaded. Therefore, it's good to wait until the page loads before you invoke any JavaScript. And again, you can create a method doing this. And here's the example we were looking at before. So the point I had before, if we were to delete this and run it, none of that works. And if we were to look at the JavaScript console, well, again, this is running through, yeah, this is running through the W3 Schools little thingy here, so we don't get the appropriate errors. But the bottom line is it doesn't work. This one, you don't click on the buttons, or the paragraphs, you click on the buttons to hide it. And again, notice that when the page finishes loading, you're creating a click event for the thing with a tag of button. Now, what if we had another button on this page? Will this one also hide the paragraphs? And the answer is yes, because this selects everything on the page with the tag of button. So if I click that, it hides the paragraph 2. What if we want to make a show button? Well, then we'd have to get a little more clever. We could give an ID of this one that says hide. An ID of this one that says show. So instead of selecting any button on the page, we would select a button with an ID of hide. Then we would select the button with an ID of show. And show all the paragraphs. And again, you can put any code you want to in this, all right? So you can have plain old JavaScript, or you can have jQuery functions. Let's get a list of jQuery functions. Here's jQuery events. jQuery API will show us all the things that we can do. So we can create a new jQuery object. We can do effects. We can hide, we can show, we can toggle. So if they're visible, we can make them hidden. If they're hidden, we can make them visible. We can make it, the paragraphs, instead of simply disappearing, we can make the paragraphs fade out by putting in fade out. Now then when we click them, they don't disappear right away, they fade out. That adds a little bit of visual interestingness to the page, if that's a word. All right, I have an example of code that I wrote. I took an example that we had before and I wrote a jQuery version of it. And let's, no, this one we were looking at before. This is the one we're looking at. This one we kind of looked at already. You can download it and review it. The only real difference is this one adds a new paragraph. So actually, let's look at this one for a second. In this one, I have 2 paragraphs with a class of disappear and 1 with a class of no disappear. I've made it when you clicked on the disappear one for it to fade out. Made it for the no disappear one to create an error message in the HTML of the error message to say, I told you so. Finally, I made the button restore make all the things with the class of disappear, fade in. Let's look at this other example. This is the example that we had last time, where if I typed in 40 hours and they're a manager, they get paid $600. Notice right off the top, I'm using jQuery library from the Google APIs. Notice I have here a mix of jQuery and just plain vanilla JavaScript. I set the onReady function to say that when you press the button with an ID of BTN process, the click event is to call process form. This, on the other hand, is just plain old JavaScript, no different than what I had before. Under validate form, I use this to clear out the errors. I use this to pull the value from the text box. And review that. This one is sort of a mix between JavaScript and jQuery. Now there's a couple of even more special libraries on top of jQuery meant specifically for the user interface, and it's cleverly called jQuery UI. And that's what relates to your assignment this week. You're to add an accordion control. And here's a video about the accordion control. Here is the documentation about it. jQuery UI, you have a whole selection of things, a whole option you can do. You can make something draggable, droppable, resizable. In addition, you can add different widgets to your page, such as the accordion. And the way the accordion works is like this. When you click on a section, it hides the rest of the sections and shows the one that you clicked on. And it does that very smoothly. We can look at the code that does this. Now, jQuery UI is its own library. It's not included in the basic jQuery library. So you have to include both the jQuery library and the jQuery UI library. And you have to also include, along with the JavaScript for the jQuery UI, there is a CSS file. And in this case, it's as simple as saying, I want to make this thing that has an idea of accordion, I want it to act like an accordion. Now, in order for that to work, you have to follow a certain framework. You have to have a header, and you have to have a div underneath it. I'm not sure if it will work with sections or not. You're certainly welcome to try that. And then what it will do is it will display all these H3s as headings, and it will display this as the content that gets shown and hid when the user clicks on the accordion control. Now there's different parameters you can do too. There's one that's called collapse content. You can customize the icons. This one keeps the space of these small. This one doesn't use auto height, so it only makes them as big as they need to be. And this one makes them sortable. So I can go and rearrange these if I want. Now that's an awful lot to do with just one command. Or, well, actually, to make it sortable, there's several commands. But again, for this many commands, that's a lot of functionality that you get from your jQuery UI. I encourage you to look through the jQuery tutorial and also look for more stuff in jQuery UI so you can do things like color animation. So that when something appears, it changes color to give further focus to it. You could combine that with the accordion to make a real cool accordion control. Other effects that we have: explode effect, makes it break apart. Disappear that way. One thing I would say is don't go wild using these things. These things ought to add value to a page and make the page more interesting, and make the page more usable. Don't necessarily just add things onto your page to make the page look cooler. All right, make sure that the things that you're adding really add to the page and are purposefully done. All right, I haven't decided what we're talking about next week. If there are no questions, I will see you in lab, or I will see you next week. The examples are out there. Again, please review them, review the different tutorials, review the videos that I posted, and we'll see you next week.